All right, y'all. I'm sorry. I had to get that stream up. But so we've worked on some HTML, CSS, and we have a nice little random web page that we're very excited about that we've worked on, right? That page is a very simple kind of static HTML page, but we're curious now, how do I go about making this presentable for more people, right? And so in order to understand that, I want to kind of talk about how are we making changes to the website, and like how do we get from the changes we're making locally to something that's presentable for people across the world, right? And so if you think about it, right, let's kind of walk through what we were doing, generally speaking, for ourselves as we were working before, right? So I was basically, we started off with like creating, this is a big VS Code window. Let me open an empty one. We started out creating a new project for ourselves on our computer, right? That project was a simple HTML project. So if for anything, right, it was maybe something like this kind of awesome website project that we had before, right? It's a very simple project, had some HTML files in there, had some CSS files, right? What we did was on our computer, we wrote the HTML, right? We used a text editor to write the HTML. And we talked about how our browsers actually allow for us to see HTML files and kind of see what's, you could see how an HTML file is presented on your browser, right? So if you remember, what we talked about with that was, I can go and I can open a file and always open an HTML file to kind of see, like how that, to see like that file in like the real world, right? So if I go to this index.html, right, this file now is being shown up on my browser, and I can clearly see the HTML, right? So HTML is a markup language. It's meant to be in a text file, but when you put HTML with a browser, now you can actually visualize the HTML, and that's when we see it, right? You need the browser to see the HTML, but you could just be transferring HTML around as a file if you wanted to just do that, right? But most times we want to see the HTML. That's the point of it, is to see it. So we use the browser to do that, right? Here we have in this example of like, okay, on the browser, I can see local HTML files and just kind of visualize them, right? But the question is, this file, where does this live? This lives on my computer, which means if you tried to type in this little path on your browser, you're not going to be able to access it, right? Because none of these folders or files exist on your machine, right? Your machine is your personal machine. It is your laptop is your laptop, and people can't access it unless you've been hacked. And if you're hacked, that's something different that you should worry about than this question that we're talking about. But you might want to figure out, how do I give access to more information for computers that are not my computer, right? Like for external folks, how do I give more information, right? And so if you remember, we talked about this as we started this process and thinking about, okay, well, there's two types of computers as it relates to kind of information sharing across the web, right? We talked about clients and we talked about servers, right? So a client computer is a computer that is making a request, right? A server is a computer that is responding to a request, right? So an example of this might be, somebody might be trying to make a request to see a particular file, and we might need to respond to that request, right? So in the case of the computer making that, that's like, hey, I want to see this index.html file, that might be the client, right? And we might have to create a server computer that will respond to those requests and give the HTML file to that other computer, right? One of the biggest differences between a client and a server in that relationship, not only in just like kind of who's asking for stuff, is clients are typically very private and secure. People don't have access to your computer all the time, right? But a server has to allow for a certain amount of access to be given out for other computers to make a request and have that request processed, right? So the simple answer is, in order to start getting into the process of making our site public, right, we need to think about how are we going to post this information up so that somebody else can request the information. How do we make this file, how do we get this file served up on a server, right? And now there's some very interesting pros to having our files on a server, right? We kind of talked about one of them when we just played around with the live server extension on VS Code, right? VS Code, if y'all don't remember, has a really dope extension. You can go to the extensions tab, right? And one of the really dope extensions on VS Code is called Live Server, which helps you launch a development server for your local machine, right? Now, the live server is really cool, right? Because once you install the live server application on VS Code, well, now you can go back to these files, these same files locally on our computer, and we can open them with the live server. And opening them with the live server then changes kind of what the path looks like on for accessing this file, right? Whereas it was really kind of just a static file here. Now it's hosted with its own IP address, right? Its own port. And there's the link, there's the path straight up to the file, right? All machines, right, have a corresponding IP address to refer to them as machines over the internet, right? So in this case, in every case, right, when you think about going to a resource, remember we talked about how every web domain that we think about is tied to some IP address. There's an IP address associated with that machine. So what our servers allow us to do is point to those particular machines using the IP address, right? And with specific ports that we open up for access, we're able to then allow for people to make specific requests of the machine at that particular port. That way, you don't have to have the whole machine accessible, only specific resources that you tailor are accessible to the public. And this is what we need to do in order to have our site accessible by more people, right? The first thing is we need a server. We need a backend to function for us on the server. But even in the case of this live server, right, this is a local development server. So even if you type this in on your machine, it wouldn't work with my file, right? It might work if you launch your own live server at this particular port, etc. But it won't solve the problem that we're looking to solve, which is we want this file accessible by more people than just us. But one of the benefits of having a server like we talked about was having a server that's hosting your files live makes it so that now you can make changes to a file, right? Like here, I'm adding a paragraph element on the server, right? And as soon as I save this, I'm gonna save this, and then I'm gonna go back to the server, right? And over time, right, as it loads, the change is loading live, right? If I go back to this regular file, well, clearly there's a versioning issue, right? Because the first time I opened this file, I didn't have that change. So in order to actually see that change, I need to whole time refresh this each time, right? One valuable thing about servers is it kind of allows for this like live reloading aspect of things too, with the files that you're hosting, right? And that is really helpful. That is definitely a very helpful part of why having this makes sense for us, right? So the first part of the answer to this question is we need to figure out how can we have a server that can host our files for us, right? And that's the essence of what happens next in taking your web page that you just worked on and getting it in front of more people, right? How do I now put this on to some server that people can get access to? Now, there's a couple different ways that you can do it. And it's not as hard or not as difficult as you may think, right? You just need to host your HTML. The word that we're talking about here is called hosting, right? Anytime you're talking about putting a file on a server, the colloquial term we use in the engineering space is hosting those files, right? So if I just do a quick little Google search on hosting HTML files, right? There might be a couple different platforms that come up that that do this, right? There's all types of platforms that will come up that show you things like, oh, you know, you can host your files here with us, or you can host your files there with us, right? So there's a lot of applications. I'm trying to think of some. So typically I don't use the third party platforms as much, but you can use platforms that will host your file for you in order to achieve this aspect, right? Basically, I'm trying to think. Anybody got a good that knows what I'm talking about, have a platform in mind that's like, oh yeah, you can host your files on such and such and it'll do this for you, right? Feel free to drop it in the chat. But there's all types of businesses that that literally their business is in you hosting your files, right? Yeah, Git is one of them. I'm actually gonna talk about that one in a second, but I'm trying to think. There's mad little like backend little platforms that do this for you, but each of those platforms is doing the same thing for you. They're creating a server that's going to have some public access to a specific port, right? And they allow you to host your files there. They allow you to host your files there in general. GoDaddy is a great one. There it is. Like that, I'm trying to think. Not like AWS is one, like right. Vercel, Heroku. Those are great ones. Those are developer friendly ones. But I'm talking about like in general for the folks that I'm saying that I'm going to say Oracle. Yeah, Oracle's a great one too. But you know, the general public doesn't normally use those specific developer platforms often, but there's a bunch of third-party ones that are like, hey, you know, just host your website here and stuff, right? But GoDaddy is a great one as an example, right? You can just pay GoDaddy a fee, and then they'll say, hey, you know, upload your file, and then here's where your file is hosted at, right? And you can interact with it. But for us, we're trying to get a little bit more technical, right? And we like want to build our own server. Maybe we want to host, we want more control over those servers, and having more control over it means that we're able to do more specific things to make the process easier for us just kind of making our things our systems more efficient, right? So one platform that is like kind of intermediary between like just regular third-party stuff and a little bit more open for you all and probably helpful for you all is GitHub, right? GitHub Pages is a really amazing hosting solution for y'all to think about using as it relates to kind of hosting your static HTML project. GitHub Pages is really is a service that GitHub provides that takes your files from your GitHub repository, right? And allows you to publish them on a GitHub hosted server that is going to then allow for you to point that, you know, use that particular, it also kind of does some stuff to give you a specific domain name for your server, and you can also buy a domain name and attach it to your GitHub Pages server. Typically that's what happens, right? You create the server, it has some random IP address. Some platforms will give you a random little URL to use to make that to go to that particular resource, but then they also maybe offer the opportunity for you to buy a domain name and attach it to that particular server. But GitHub Pages is a really helpful platform, a really great aspect to the GitHub platform that is really helpful to know about because it lets you do this for free as well. With GitHub Pages, right, it's very simple. Like we talked about, we've done already, create a repository, right? And then you are able to add GitHub Pages to your repository after. So here they're showing you how to add your files and stuff. And when you push, you're able to, so GitHub Pages basically asks you to use a specific GitHub Pages URL, or for lack of better words, for referencing that will reference your specific repo. So you create a repo that has your GitHub username .github.io, and you can get a free hosting through GitHub for whatever files you add to that repo. So if you were to take these HTML files and rename your repo to something like this, and then also you'll be able to then use GitHub Pages to host that repository for yourself, right? they also have these project sites. So every user can use the github.io for their username. So if you want to make a personal website, you can make the HTML files, add it to this particular repo with your username and host it. But for the case of your group, right, y'all started a project already, right? And essentially you can now take that project, right, that y'all just worked on and walk through the process of hosting it on GitHub pages, right? In order to do that on GitHub, it's a very simple fix. You change the repository settings to use GitHub pages, and then you're able to find that repo using GitHub pages. So GitHub pages acts like a third-party solution for what we're talking about, and we'll get more into, which is creating a server that is going to host our files, right? GoDaddy, all these other platforms do similar stuff, but GitHub is one that's more technically inclined, because here, as you can see, you can connect this to a repo, and it makes it very simple to add the process of hosting to a GitHub project that you're working on already. So hosting is really important, though, to your credit. Some other platforms folks mentioned, some folks mentioned AWS, right? And AWS as a cloud provider has a number of different web services that you can use to host objects, like as storage, right? Every major cloud provider has some system that allows for you to store your files, right? And you can use that platform also as a way of hosting your web service, your websites too. A lot of what we're going to start talking about, though, is clearly it's important to have a server, and it has to have some IP address, some port, and all of this stuff, right? So the question you might be wondering now is, well, how does this part happen? Like, how does it happen that the server then creates the actual port that will run and somebody can go to and see the file, right? With GitHub pages, you're not going to get that depth of information. They try to make it so simple that you don't have to think about it, right? But in our class, in our case, we want to think about it. We want to know, right? So what we're going to be doing next week and stuff is working on the server side and working on the back end, so that we can understand, how do we create a server, and what do we do on the server side to host, to like basically present a file when somebody's looking to get a file, right? So we'll recreate the local server that we see here using some backend languages. That's what we're going to get into next. But for the case of today, in the case of this short week of weeks that we have, I really wanted to give you an introduction to the process of like what's going on in a higher level sense, right? So if that makes sense, this kind of topic as a topic of inquiry, give it a thumbs up so I know y'all still rocking with me. Y'all ain't fall asleep on your boy. But yeah, this is the most important part of like what happens next. Is just like knowing, okay, cool, like I want to take this file and put it up there. And because we made our project on GitHub, I'd love for y'all to try to use GitHub pages to make a project site out of that particular project for your group, so that y'all have a link that you can use to refer to that project. And so last thing I'm going to say on this, well, actually, this is all I'm going to say as it relates to this initial part of hosting.